Australia has just entered the Tomahawk era. But here is the question that should concern every Australian watching this closely. If our most powerful new naval strike weapon depends on American stockpiles, American industry, and American priorities, how sovereign is that capability when a real crisis begins? In December 2024, HMAS Brisbane successfully fired a Tomahawk cruise missile off the west coast of the United States, a milestone that placed Australia in an extremely small club of nations able to field and launch this kind of long-range strike weapon. Canberra has committed to buying more than 200 Tomahawks, and on paper that looks like a dramatic leap in Australian military power. With a range of roughly 2,500 kilometers, Tomahawk gives the Royal Australian Navy something it has never truly had before: the ability to hold distant targets at risk far beyond the immediate battle space. That matters because Australia's strategic outlook has changed. The old assumption that geography alone could protect the continent is no longer enough in an Indo-Pacific shaped by long-range missiles, coercive pressure, and faster-moving military contingencies. But this is where the story turns. Tomahawk is not just a missile. It is part of an American-controlled weapons ecosystem involving mission planning, software, sustainment, logistics, and supply. And in 2026, that dependency suddenly looks much more serious. Recent reporting indicates the United States expended hundreds of Tomahawks in operations linked to Iran, while separate reports have warned that Japan's own Tomahawk deliveries may be delayed as Washington manages competing demands on production and inventory. That does not mean the United States is abandoning allies. It means something more uncomfortable. In a high-pressure strategic environment, even close allies can find themselves waiting in line behind America's own operational needs. So the real issue is not whether Australia bought a formidable missile. It did. The issue is whether Australia has bought a durable warfighting capability or simply rented access to one of the world's most effective strike systems for as long as the United States can spare it. And once you ask that question, Tomahawk stops being just a weapons story. It becomes a story about sovereignty, alliance risk, and whether Australia is truly prepared for the missile age. To understand why Australia made this move, you have to step back and look at how quickly the strategic environment has shifted, because this decision did not come out of nowhere. It came out of a growing realization inside Canberra that the old model of defense was no longer enough for the world we are now living in. For decades, Australia relied on distance as a natural shield, a continent far from major conflict zones, protected by oceans and time. But that assumption has been steadily eroding as long-range missiles, advanced surveillance, and precision strike systems have spread across the Indo-Pacific, compressing distance in a way that makes geography far less reliable as a form of security. This is exactly what the Defense Strategic Review in 2023 and the National Defense Strategy in 2024 and 2026 were responding to: a clear shift toward what Australian planners call a strategy of denial, where the goal is not just to defend the continent, but to prevent any adversary from projecting power into Australia's approaches in the first place. In that context, having the ability to strike targets at long range is no longer a luxury. It is a requirement, because without it, Australia risks being confined to reacting rather than shaping events. That is where Tomahawk comes in, offering a ready-made solution that can be integrated onto Hobart-class destroyers and eventually onto nuclear-powered submarines under the AUKUS pathway, giving Australia an immediate increase in reach without waiting a decade for a domestic system to be designed and built. It also strengthens interoperability with the United States Navy, allowing Australian vessels to operate more seamlessly within a larger allied force structure, which is a critical advantage in any regional contingency. But there is another layer to this decision that often gets overlooked, and that is speed, because building a sovereign missile industry takes years, even decades, while the strategic risks identified in recent defense planning documents are already present now. So Canberra made a calculated choice: accept dependence in the short term in order to close a dangerous capability gap, while investing heavily in long-term self-reliance through initiatives like the Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Enterprise. And on the surface, that looks like a rational and necessary compromise, but it also sets up a tension that runs through everything that follows, because the faster you plug the gap with external systems, the more exposed you become to external constraints when those systems are needed most. That tension becomes much clearer when you look at how the system actually works behind the scenes, because what Australia has acquired is not just a stockpile of missiles. It is access to an entire American-controlled ecosystem that governs how those missiles are maintained, updated, and ultimately used in real-world conditions. The Tomahawk system depends on specialized mission planning software, secure data links, ongoing technical support, and a supply chain that stretches deep into the United States defense industrial base. And while that integration delivers a high level of capability, it also means that key elements of control do not sit fully within Australian hands. This is reinforced by the structure of foreign military sales agreements, which are designed to ensure interoperability but also include strict oversight mechanisms such as enhanced end-use monitoring, meaning that inventory tracking, configuration, and sustainment are closely tied to United States systems and approval processes. In peacetime, this arrangement works smoothly and even strengthens the alliance. But in a period of heightened tension or conflict, priorities can shift very quickly. Recent developments have already highlighted how fragile that balance can become, with reports indicating that Japan may face delays in receiving its own Tomahawk missiles as the United States adjusts production and allocation in response to its own operational requirements. This is not a political decision aimed at allies. It is a structural reality of how modern defense supply chains function under pressure, where production, capacity, skilled labor, and critical components are finite and must be prioritized. At the same time, global missile inventories are under increasing strain, with the United States having expended large numbers of long-range strike weapons in recent operations, forcing a renewed focus on replenishment and stockpile management. For Australia, this raises a difficult but unavoidable question, because even if the missiles have been purchased and delivered, the ability to sustain operations depends on continued access to spare parts, software updates, targeting support, and follow-on resupply, all of which remain linked to American capacity and decision-making. So the risk is not that the supply is deliberately cut off, but that it becomes constrained at exactly the moment when demand is highest, creating a situation where Australia technically possesses a powerful strike capability, yet finds that its endurance in a prolonged crisis is shaped by factors beyond its direct control. That concern moved from theory to reality as global demand for long-range strike weapons surged in recent years, exposing a deeper problem that Australia cannot ignore, because modern warfare is no longer defined by how advanced a weapon is, but by how quickly it can be replaced once it is used. Reports from early 2026 indicate that the United States has expended a significant number of Tomahawk missiles in recent operations, prompting renewed urgency inside Washington to rebuild stockpiles and accelerate production. But the industrial base is not designed to expand overnight. Missile manufacturing relies on specialized components, highly trained labor, and tightly integrated supply chains, many of which are already operating near capacity, meaning that even with increased funding, there is a lag between demand and delivery. This creates a bottleneck that affects not only the United States, but also every allied nation that depends on the same production lines, including Australia. The situation becomes even more complex when multiple regions demand attention at the same time, because strategic planning documents in the United States have already highlighted the possibility of concurrent pressures across different theaters, forcing difficult choices about where resources are allocated first. In this environment, the priority is always to ensure that United States forces remain fully equipped, which naturally places allied deliveries and resupply further down the queue during periods of strain. This is not a breakdown of the alliance. It is a reflection of how national defense systems operate under pressure, where domestic requirements take precedence over external commitments. For Australia, the implication is significant because even a relatively modest delay in resupply can have an outsized impact when stockpiles are limited and operational demands are high. What appears to be a large inventory on paper can quickly become a constrained resource in practice, especially if replenishment cycles stretch out over months or years instead of weeks. This is why recent developments involving potential delays to other allied missile deliveries have attracted so much attention, as they offer a glimpse into how quickly the balance can shift when production capacity is under stress. And once that pressure builds, The question is no longer about whether Australia has access to advanced weapons, but whether it has the industrial depth and strategic resilience to sustain their use over time. This is where the numbers begin to tell a very different story from the headlines, because owning more than 200 long-range cruise missiles sounds like a decisive advantage. Yet in a real operational context, that figure represents only a limited window of sustained capability rather than an endless supply of firepower. Each Hobart-class destroyer is equipped with 48 vertical launch system cells, and those cells are not dedicated exclusively to long-range strike weapons. They must also carry surface-to-air missiles, anti-submarine weapons, and other essential systems required for survivability and mission flexibility. That means the number of long-range missiles available on any single vessel is constrained by trade-offs that commanders must make before deployment, balancing offensive reach against defensive resilience. When you extend that logic across the fleet, the total number of missiles available for use at any given time becomes far smaller than the headline figure suggests, and once those missiles are expended, replenishment is not immediate, especially under the supply pressures already discussed. In a high-intensity scenario, the rate of expenditure can be significantly higher than peacetime planning assumptions, not because of inefficiency, but because modern operations demand rapid, precise, and repeated use of long-range strike to achieve strategic effects. At the same time, Australia does not yet possess a comprehensive layered missile defense system capable of offsetting incoming threats at scale, which means that while it can project power outward, its ability to absorb sustained pressure remains limited. This creates a strategic imbalance where offensive capability is introduced faster than defensive depth can be built, increasing the importance of careful resource management and alliance coordination. The result is a situation where the perception of strength can outpace the reality of endurance, particularly if conflict extends beyond initial phases and becomes a prolonged contest of logistics and industrial output. So the real issue is not whether Australia can deliver a powerful strike. It clearly can, but how long it can maintain that capability before constraints begin to shape operational choices. And once those constraints emerge, they do not just influence tactics, they redefine the entire strategic posture. What all of this leads to is a much larger strategic question that goes beyond any single weapons system, because the real issue facing Australia is not whether it has access to advanced strike capabilities, but how those capabilities are sustained, controlled, and integrated over time in a rapidly changing security environment. In recent policy updates, including the National Defense Strategy released in 2026, Canberra has made it clear that increasing self-reliance is now a central objective, not as a replacement for the alliance with the United States, but as a necessary complement to it. This is reflected in major investments aimed at building a domestic guided weapons and explosive ordnance enterprise, expanding local production of systems such as guided multiple launch rocket systems, and strengthening partnerships with international industry to diversify supply chains. These efforts signal a recognition that future conflicts are likely to be defined by industrial capacity as much as by technological sophistication, where the ability to produce, maintain, and replenish weapons becomes just as important as the ability to deploy them. At the same time, Australia continues to deepen its integration with allied forces through initiatives such as the AUKUS partnership, which will eventually deliver nuclear-powered submarines capable of carrying similar long-range strike systems, further embedding Australia within a broader network of collective deterrence. The challenge lies in balancing these two directions, maintaining the benefits of alliance interoperability while gradually reducing critical dependencies that could limit operational flexibility under pressure. This is not a simple transition, because building sovereign capability requires time, sustained funding, and a coordinated national effort across government and industry, while the strategic risks identified in recent years are already present and evolving. So Australia finds itself navigating a dual-track approach, relying on allied systems in the short term while investing heavily to ensure greater independence in the future. And this brings the discussion back to its central insight, because in the emerging missile age, power is no longer defined by the possession of advanced weapons alone, but by the resilience of the systems that support them, the depth of the stockpiles behind them, and the strategic autonomy that determines when and how they can be used. In that sense, The true measure of Australia's defense capability will not be what it can launch on the first day of a crisis, but what it can sustain in the days, weeks, and months that follow.